Hi, I'm Dave, Director of Cosmere Festival, and in honour of National Reader Book Day, here's my video about my book collection, and most importantly, how many books do I actually own? This was inspired in part by this video that popped up in my YouTube feed this week from the Book Leo, talking about their 100th book purchase, and I've been around on the planet a lot longer, so I knew there was going to be a lot of books in my collection, so I thought I'd figure out how many there were and tell you about it. There were some other reasons for doing the count, not just the Book Leo's influence. I've been wanting to do a video for a while about how many books I had and the kinds of books I had and who I am as a reader. And after that whole video earlier in the month, it was also my birthday and we were away, so I ended up acquiring even more books. And I had to find a place to put them in the flat, so how many books I had was really preying on my mind. One head start I had was that a couple of years ago, we put a large chunk of books into storage to make some space, and I used an app called the My Library app on my phone to help me remember which books I had so I didn't buy them again by mistake. The app gives you a spreadsheet, and I already knew that there were 290 books on that spreadsheet. So all I had to do was scan the rest of the books and then come up with the final total, right? It took a bit more time than that. So I scanned all the books here. I had to remember books that I'd lent to people, always a challenge for anybody with a library, and then also think about the books that are hiding in corners that I forgot to scan the first time around and got there eventually. I put them all in the spreadsheet, spent hours and hours tidying up the data, and I ended up with a figure which absolutely blew my mind. I had 499 physical books. Now some caveats. My parents have more of my childhood books at home than I have here, but they're in storage, they're in their attic, they're not here, I don't know what they are, so I ignored them. Secondly, there might well be more books that I've lent to people that I can't remember that are out there in the world. I didn't worry too much about that, but the figure could be slightly different, but not by much. Thirdly, I just counted my books. Not these books you see here, which belong to my other half. These were just my books. And I had a couple of reactions when I got to this count. Firstly, wow, that's a lot of books. For me anyway, for someone that lives in a small flat, that's a lot of books. And secondly, I can't stick on 499. That doesn't feel right. So I went out and I bought more books. Specifically, I bought these ones. These are books 500 and 501. I bought them at the same time, so they are joint winners of that award. So that takes the final physical total to 501 books. But I didn't want to stop there. Why would you stop there when you're as nerdy as I am? I also then counted up the ebooks that I owned and the audiobooks that I owned and added them all into a final total. Turns out I own 142 ebooks and 99 audiobooks, and I was very good and I didn't buy one more audiobook to make it around 100. I'll just wait for my next credit. I know. So that creates a grand total of 742 books that are in my possession. Now there are many people out there in the world who've got more books than that. But when I think about my financial situation, my living situations, other things that I've needed to spend money on over the years, I'm really proud that I've been able to amass that collection. It feels really good to have that much words and stories and ideas in my life, and I'm really pleased with that outcome. Now for the rest of the video, I'm going to do a little bit of analysis of the books that I've got, and hopefully this will be of interest to you. If it's not, skip to the end, or we'll see you on the next one. For those of you that like a bit of data breakdown, strap in, we're going to get into it. Firstly, how did I do the data? I know this is important. I decided when I was doing the tidy up to pick 20 categories which the books would cover. Broadly speaking, those go into non-fiction, fiction, and then science fiction, fantasy, and horror. The non-fiction and fiction have got some kind of subgroups like crime fiction and biography and autobiography. I'm not going to get into all those here, but this graph shows you the breakdown between those key top levels. But essentially I wanted to see where the balance was in terms of my collections. Unsurprisingly, science fiction and fantasy are the big ones. As this is the Cosmere Festival channel, I'm now going to pretty much ignore all of the non-fiction and the non-SFF fiction, and we're going to focus just in on all of the science fiction, fantasy and horror writing which is in the collection. This does mean that two of my favourite authors are not going to be included in some of these figures, which makes me sad. I'm only including Ian M. Banks, not the non-M books, and I'm also not including some of the Neil Stephenson books because they aren't set in that kind of world. So here are the top 5 authors represented in the collection. Coming in at joint number 1, Stephen R. Donaldson and Peter F. Hamilton, both on 17. But I do want to stress that one of those Stephen Donaldson books is the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which is 3 books in 1 volume, so he could easily be on 19 if I just bought them a little bit differently. Then we've got Stephen King with 16, and in joint 4th place, Ian M. Banks and Neil Asher on 14. If I had included the non-M Ian Banks, he'd be on 24, and aside from Enid Blyton, would be my most bought author. Now, none of these were a surprise. I've spent a lot of my book buying time buying into big epic series that I got hooked into. The Dark Tower series, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, all of those Neil Asher polity books, the culture novels. So I start acquiring books then in a series because I want to see that story through. That is why there's a big chunk of Kevin Anderson books, because I just read all of the Saga of the Seven Sons. These aren't necessarily all my favourite books, and in terms of those authors, unfortunately Ian's not around anymore to write anymore, and there's at least one other author on that list that I'm not buying anymore. So in 10 years' time, those numbers might start to look a bit different, although I'm not sure I'm buying now as prolific an authors as some of those have been. Now, speaking of series, I took a brief look at the fantasy novels in the collection. There's 100 odd of those, and about 75% of them were part of a series. With the horror, it's about 50%. Science fiction, I didn't do the maths on it because it was a little bit more tricky, but it's still a pretty high percentage. I wouldn't be surprised if it's 40%. I love a series, I can't say this enough. Now, what about publishers? So number 1 with a bullet was Orbit with 56, and number 2 was Gollancz with 42. And Harper Collins, Harper Voyager, Voyager Classics, that kind of conglomerate with 37. And then trailing behind are Pan and Macmillan together with 26, and then Hodder with 19. Just trailing behind Random House and Tor with slightly less. Again, these aren't surprises. Orbit and Gollancz have published a lot of the books by authors that are my top authors, or have published a lot of genre fiction over the years. And I'm really interested to see what's going to happen over the next 10 years with new publishers. I would imagine that my Titan Books collection will increase, because that was already a pretty decent number, and that new imprints like Ad Astra will start to affect what I have in the collection. The last thing I looked at in terms of statistics was which years were the books published. Now, I decided in the spreadsheet to put in the publication date being the date that that version of the book was published. I've got a lot of paperbacks, there's ebooks, audiobooks, so it doesn't necessarily represent when the book was first released into the wild. So not so good for dating the periods of writing that I like, but is more useful, I think, for dating when I'm buying books, although not foolproof, of course. Let's look at the numbers. Put them all on a graph between 1999 and now. I picked 1999 because that's when I went to university, I had access to a better bookshop, and I had a bit more disposable income to buy books, and that's when my adult collecting really started. These were the years that stood out to me. Last year, I bought 40 books, but 26 of them were science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I just started a festival of science fiction and fantasy, so I was buying a lot of books. Those books I bought yesterday were also published in 2019. But the two years that are the biggest were 2008 and 2011. 2011 I bought 49 books, 2008 48, but less than half of those books were genre writing. So I was obviously still buying my genre books, but I was probably buying the big books by the big authors that I liked. And over the years, the balance between genre fiction and all the other books that I've bought has definitely fluctuated. There's two other influences on these books that I think I want to stress. The first one of those is audiobooks. So years when I've had a subscription to an audiobook service, or there was a year when the BBC released loads of audiobooks on their own platform, my book buying has increased because I've been buying at least one book a month, even if I never went anywhere near a bookshop. And the years when I couldn't afford a subscription to an audiobook service, I think they're years when it's lower down. Secondly is Kindle, and we're going to come back to Kindle ebooks and what I think about that in a little moment. But years when I've been not as well off, I've still managed to supplement my book buying with ebooks, and they've been mostly through the Kindle book service. And I think there's some jumps here in terms of statistics from about 2006, 5, 6, something like that, where I think I got my first Kindle and I started to buy books on there. I got free books, public domain books, and Kindle deals, and my book buying could increase. Last thing I want to note is that there are years that I have sadly neglected, and I think future videos I might get into buying some books from these years to see what I've missed. So, for example, and I've got my notes here, 2016, I only bought 16 books, and only 6 of them were genre books. Don't know what was happening that year, but I need to figure it out. Similarly, I think if I was looking later back in the decade, a year like 2004 when I only bought 9 genre books, or even the year 2000 when I bought 6 books out of a total of 11, I need to figure out what books were published those years and maybe buy some and expand so that I've got a bit more of a diversity of years than I currently have. Now, what I didn't do was calculate my TBR number. I know this is a popular thing to do on BookTube, but with 740 books to go through, I haven't had the energy yet to figure out if I've read them all or not. I would assume the figure is probably somewhere between 30 and 40% of books are still to be read. Considering that I've just acquired about 15 books in the last month, you'll be unsurprised to learn that there were lots of books out there that I still haven't got to in my collection. The last thing I want to talk about was Kindle and why I have used the Kindle store over the years to build my book collection. Obviously, I've got a lot more physical books than I have Kindle books, but the store has been really useful for me in some specific contexts. The first one is when I've not had very much money, when I've been in a low-paying job or unemployed. The kind of deals available have been a real lifesaver. Secondly, I used to buy Kindle books to try out new authors. So I've come across some really great stuff on that store, and I've subsequently then moved to buying physical books by that author. And the Numenon Ultra, the first 2 books I got on Kindle, but I was really excited to buy the last one on physical form. So I've purchased that since our last haul video. Also, I think I probably bought stuff that I knew I'd never really want on my shelves. I wouldn't loan to anybody, and I've got a lot of kind of sports writing that fits in with that category, which obviously has not got a place in this video. So that's the book collection. If you want me to do more analysis into it and give you some more data, I'm really happy to do so. And if you're inspired to do this yourself, please share with us on social media your own graphs and bar charts and stats. It'd be really interesting to hear how many books you've got and the balance between the different genres and what you like to collect and what the data tells you about your collecting. It's been really important for me over the last 2 years to get out of my reading rut. That's what those top 5 authors represent, me spending all of my disposable income on the same people as they publish a book every year. So it was important to me to make a change. When I was standing in the bookshop yesterday, I found some books that I really wanted to buy, but also books that represented those 2 sides to my book buying. Neil Stephenson represents me buying books that I love and becoming invested in authors that I really enjoy and kind of buying everything they've published. That's what I did with Ian Banks, that's what I did with Alyson Reynolds, that's what I did with Peter Hamilton. I became a completist because I love their storytelling. But that is the rut. It represents a great author, but also a buying and reading rut. The second book, The Joint 500th, is Tally Thompson, and it's the final book in the Rosewater series. And the first book in that series was, I think, the first one that I bought when I decided I needed to actively get out of my reading rut. I saw it on the shelves in a bookshop, I thought it looked really interesting, read it, loved it, bought the sequel. It was the first book we talked about at a book club for Cosmere at last year's festival, and it felt really apt that not only did I want to read it, but also it represented that trying new things, expanding horizons, and continuing to be open to new writers. This is a really exciting time for genre. I think the world has opened up to these multiple voices, and it's a great time to be buying 40-50 books a year. So expect to see a lot more purchases from me, a lot more haul videos from me as we go on, and some filling in some gaps in some of those years that are sadly underrepresented. I hope you enjoyed this video and a little insight into my book buying and the nerdy way that you can analyse it. As ever, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.